Hello friends, I am Chevee. Welcome to my shed. How are you today? How's life in your world? How's things where you are? Hope it's all good and great and fantastic. And I have read some manga. This in particular is Junji Ito, and I said a while back I might talk about it, so let's talk about it. If you're unaware, manga has exploded in the past year and a half, 2 years in the United States. It had a kind of a heyday a decade or more ago. Lots of people were reading it, and then it kind of went away. We used to be able to get Weekly Shonen Jump here, which is like the biggest manga magazine in Japan, but that's hasn't been done in English for a long time. But recently, just in the past 2 years or so, manga has exploded. And if you go to the bookstores, there's probably a huge growing manga section that's just started to happen, like within the last 6 months, because there's been a huge demand for it. And this, in particular, is something that I was definitely interested in, which is horror. Junji Ito writes what is considered to be the pinnacle of Japanese horror manga. And he writes his horror manga in collections generally. A lot of these are collections. Some of these are individual stories, meaning that this whole book is the story of Remina or Ramina, but it's broken up into chapters because it's still written and published like a traditional manga, like, you know, a chapter a week, and then once it's all collected, it's put into a volume. So he has a few of those, but a lot of these are, well, this is another one, and Uzumaki is another one that are single stories told through a series of chapters. And then these are collections, and he has a bunch of these collections. This represents about half of what's available for Junji Ito in English, and I gotta tell you, we started with reading Remina or Ramina in the Rolling Dice and Taking Names Discord channel. This was our book of the month for our manga club we started, and this is a wild book. It is... It is a very, very, very bizarre story, and I don't just mean that this is my take on Junji Ito. His bizarreness isn't just weird horror, right? It's not like he comes up with some weird horror idea and weaves that into a story. His stories are also bizarre. Right? Everything about it is bizarre, meaning that the characters in the story make really weird choices. The characters in the story just seem to accept everything that's happening. There appears to be time jumps that we're not, as the readers, pervy to. It just kind of happens, and you have to accept the fact that maybe this isn't the same day that you were reading one page before. It's very bizarre and hard to follow at times. And I think that that is part of the cultural aspect of his work that doesn't translate well into English. For instance, Uzumaki. Uzumaki is a story about a town that becomes overtaken by spirals. And literally, I mean spirals. Like anything that's shaped in a spiral pattern ends up perverting somebody or something and turning this town into a walking nightmare. People turn into snails. The town itself starts to form into a spiral. Crazy stuff happens. And in the beginning of the book, it just kind of stuff starts being a little bit peculiar, and people were like, whoa. And as the book goes on, people just come to accept the fact that they are walled off from the rest of the world by some unforeseen force that is turning their town into spirals. And it's all spiral, spiral, spirals. This word, Uzumaki, is literally... Maki is a spiral, or, you know, that spiral pattern. It doesn't quite work. Like, it works, and it's creepy, but I think possibly some of the feeling of it is lost in translation simply because, like, that word doesn't necessarily mean much. Like, we don't use the spiral word very much in the English language. It's not a very common thing to say or to talk about. We don't recognize that, but it appears, at least in this, that there is some sort of cultural significance to spirals. And if you know anything about, like, Naruto's headband or the maki that's in ramen, it seems to be something that's a little bit more pervasive in Japan. So being afraid of that makes much more sense in Japan than it does here. And so a lot of this carries that sort of like cultural undertone that makes it special. Like I don't know how to explain it. It's not exactly. It's not that what he's writing doesn't make sense. It makes sense. It just makes sense in this very weird like frame of reference. Like your frame of reference as an American English speaker reading some of this doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that's what makes it special. On top of that, his artwork. His artwork is phenomenal, and I'm not going to show any of it on screen because it's you can go Google it and see some of his more bizarre stuff. He writes what a lot of people call, or he draws what a lot of people call body horror. A lot of these books are focused on people being twisted or perverted in very strange and obtuse ways that make them living horrors. And he draws a lot of really grotesque stuff. But at the same time, some of it isn't. Like when I mentioned Ramina, it's not this. There's not really a lot of body horror in here. It's not really about that. One of his most recent release, Censor, got released I think a couple of months ago in English. I read a lot of reviews where people said this was his like least. They didn't like this one as much. Interestingly enough, I might have liked this one the best. I'm not definite on that yet, but this one tells a more cohesive story, whereas the other stories, the other collections especially, the collections obviously are more like anthologies. They don't really tell a story. They're just, here's a collection of random weird horror. But Ramina and Uzumaki, when you compare them to Censor, Censor tells a complete tale about a person going through a change. Things happen. You know, it really, whereas these other two, or especially Uzumaki, is more like just a bunch of snippets of random things happening, and this person has to accept that they're happening. Whereas with Censor, there's a little bit more of a continuum between the chapters. It's a very, very, very strange writing style, and I think I really like it. I've read all of this. It's definitely not something that I would say if you're looking for a good read, it's not like that, right? Like, there are some manga that you can read without looking at the pictures, and it flows very well and tells a very good story. Junji Ito relies on his pictures, seeming sometimes more than the words. The words are insignificant. To the visual, what is happening is much more important. And so it takes a little bit more of a... You have to really kind of care for it. I don't know how to explain it. You'd have to just kind of go read it. And some of these are available online. You can read them for free at various sites. And I think that if you're interested in reading some really twisted, funky horror type stuff, go check it out and give it a read, and then maybe pick up some of his books. Some of these tell some Poe-esque stories. You know, they're like there's these little snippets of a weird event that happened, and they're not necessarily. It's not really about character. It's not really about somebody going through a growth cycle or maybe even a downfall cycle. It's more like let's make something weird happen to somebody and see how they react. And that's kind of it. Like each chapter is just something bizarre happening to somebody, and you get to see how they react. And I think it works. Like I think it works really well. It's a very, 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 very different to the other manga that I've read, which wants to tell a more cinematic story. This is more of like a... After every chapter, I have to take a breath and go, what did I just read? Like, what was that? What just happened? And I have to kind of wrap my head around it. It took me a while to get through Uzumaki because each chapter got progressively more like, what? It just got so bizarre by the end. It was just hard to wrap my head around it. I really can recommend it, though. I can. It's just very different. Very, very different. If you're interested in reading manga and you don't necessarily know where to start, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this. I would recommend something like Attack on Titan or maybe Tokyo Ghoul or one of the bigger One Piece type stories, whereas One Punch Man, this is much more eclectic, and I think that's part of the reason I like it, because I've always been a bit of a contrarian. So Junji Ito, if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on any of these specific books, let me know in the comments and we can talk about them. And I will probably get to read his other stuff soon, but I finally started on the Wheel of Time. I want to at least get the first two books out of the way before the show starts. So I'm started on the Wheel of Time the other day, and I'm halfway through it. So, or I have the world. We'll be talking about that soon. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, and being amazing friends, wonderful people. I really appreciate you. And I'll see you again tomorrow. Today's word you should know to sound smart is impalpable. It's an adjective meaning difficult to understand easily or intangible. The soul is so impalpable, so often useless, and sometimes such a nuisance that I felt no more emotion on losing it than if, on a stroll, I had mislaid my visiting card. Charles Baudelaire, a French poet, critic, and translator. Impalpable. I-M-P-A-L-P-A-B-L-E. I really wish we all carried visiting cards more. Not like business cards, but just a visiting card, like Chevee was here. And I just had that. Like, that was an important item for me to carry. Like, were they trading cards back in the day? Was there prestige for having somebody's visiting card?